In 1817, the Italian explorer Giovanni Battista Caviglia worked his way back into one of the least understood spaces inside the Great Pyramid of Giza. He was not heading for the King's Chamber and not for the Grand Gallery, but for something lower, darker, and far less celebrated, the underground chamber cut into the living bedrock beneath the monument. The Great Pyramid was built for Khufu in the 4th dynasty on a rocky plateau west of the Nile. From its northern entrance, a sloping corridor descends through the masonry of the pyramid, then continues into the natural rock below, ending in what Britannica describes as an unfinished underground chamber. That simple fact is easy to miss, but it changes the way we think about the pyramid. This was never only a structure rising above the desert. From the very beginning, it also reached downward into the earth. Tonight, that is where we are going. Not upward toward the chamber lined in granite, not into the familiar tourist route, but below the pyramid's base, below the level of the plateau, into a quieter and more uncertain world of cut stone, natural bedrock, shafts, corridors, and rooms whose purpose is still debated. Some of these spaces have been known for 2 centuries. Others have only become clearer through modern scanning. Together, they suggest that the lower half of the pyramid may be more meaningful than it first appears. If you picture the Great Pyramid, you probably imagine a clean geometric mountain of stone, sealed and still beneath the Egyptian sky. But inside it, and beneath it, the reality is stranger. A descending passage cuts down through the body of the monument. An underground chamber lies at its end. Elsewhere, shafts connect different levels of the interior. And in recent years, non-invasive research has shown that even now, the pyramid still contains spaces we did not fully know were there. That is the mood of this journey. Not treasure hunting, not fantasy, and not the louder world of conspiracy. What lies beneath the Great Pyramid is already extraordinary enough without invention. There is bedrock architecture below the monument. There are unfinished or unexplained spaces. There are later discoveries beneath Giza, like the Osiris Shaft, that remind us how much of the plateau extends downward as well as upward. And there are modern tools, muon studies, radar, imaging, that are slowly giving us a clearer map of what earlier generations could only imagine. So tonight, we begin where so many mysteries of the Great Pyramid begin, not at the summit, but at the entrance to a passage sloping into darkness, a corridor cut with intention, a chamber carved into stone, a lower world beneath one of the most famous buildings on Earth. And as we move slowly downward, we will ask a question that is older than modern archaeology itself. What exactly did the builders place beneath the Great Pyramid, and why did they choose to send part of their monument into the bedrock below? The pyramid does not simply stand on the desert. It rises from a particular kind of ground on a particular plateau in a place chosen with extraordinary care. The Great Pyramid stands on the Giza Plateau, a broad outcrop of limestone west of the Nile. Even today, the monument feels inseparable from that stone landscape. It does not appear lightly placed there, like an object set on a surface. It feels rooted, heavy, and almost geological in its presence, as though it belongs to the plateau as much as to human history. That impression is not misleading. Part of the pyramid was indeed built from local limestone, and part of its interior design reaches down into the natural rock below. The lower chamber of the pyramid, the Subterranean Chamber, is not suspended inside the masonry like the King's Chamber higher up. It is cut into the bedrock itself. That means the monument is not only an upward construction of stacked stone, it is also, in part, a downward carving into the earth. This changes the way we imagine the pyramid. From a distance, the Great Pyramid seems like a complete and self-contained mountain of stone rising cleanly into the sky. But internally, its story is more complex. One route inside the monument does not climb, it descends. From the entrance on the north face, a passage slopes downward through the pyramid and continues into the bedrock beneath it, ending in the lowest known chamber in the entire structure. Because it tells us that the builders were thinking not only about height, visibility, and mass, but also the relationship between the monument and the ground below it. The pyramid was anchored physically in the plateau, but perhaps also conceptually. Its architecture does not stop at the base. It crosses that boundary and enters the stone beneath the monument. The more quietly we think about that, the stranger it becomes. Most people imagine the real mystery of the Great Pyramid to be somewhere near its summit, or in the upper chambers, or in the famous gallery that rises inside it. But one of the oldest and most puzzling parts of the monument is below all of that, in a place where built space gives way to living rock. The transition is so smooth that the pyramid almost seems to merge with the plateau itself. And this is why the bedrock matters so much. Without it, the pyramid would still be immense, but with it, the monument becomes something more than a built mass. It becomes a structure tied directly to the geology of Giza. The visible pyramid above and the hidden carved spaces below belong to the same architectural idea. What rises toward the sky is only part of the design. Another part goes down. Down through limestone, down below the base, down into a chamber whose purpose remains uncertain, and into a lower realm that most visitors never see. And perhaps that is the most important thought to carry forward into the next part of our journey. The Great Pyramid is not only a monument standing on the plateau, it is also a monument entering it. And once we understand that, the underground chamber no longer feels like an afterthought. It feels like the beginning of a deeper question. What exactly were the builders doing beneath the pyramid?
And now, having paused to see how the Great Pyramid is tied to the stone beneath it, we can move down into the most elusive room in the monument, the Subterranean Chamber. It is the lowest known chamber in the Great Pyramid and the only main chamber cut directly into the bedrock below the monument. Reached by the descending passage from the north, it lies beneath the base of the pyramid in a darker and rougher world than the familiar spaces above. Britannica describes it as an unfinished underground chamber, and that has long been the standard interpretation. At first glance, the room does seem to support that idea. It does not have the polished certainty of the king's chamber. It does not have the formal shape of a completed granite burial room. Parts of it look rough. The floor, especially, has often been described as irregular and unfinished, with trenches and uneven rises in the rock. Early investigators, such as Flinders Petrie, carefully recorded these features, helping to establish the chamber as one of the strangest spaces inside the pyramid. And yet the room is not simply chaotic. That is what makes it so difficult to dismiss. Even if the floor appears rough, other parts of the chamber show clear intention. The chamber was cut where the descending passage naturally ends. Its ceiling and upper surfaces do not look accidental. The room belongs to the plan of the pyramid, even if that plan was later altered, or even if this chamber was never completed in the form originally intended. The standard explanation is that the subterranean chamber may have been an early burial chamber design that was later abandoned in favor of higher chambers within the pyramid. But the evidence does not make the room feel meaningless. It feels deliberate, even if its final purpose remains uncertain. There's another reason the chamber continues to hold attention. It does not consist only of one room. Opposite the entrance, a blind corridor runs southward into the rock and then stops. That detail has fascinated researchers for generations because it creates a feeling of interruption, as though the chamber belongs to a design that continues just beyond what we can see. Petrie and later descriptions also note a niche and other irregular features that resist a simple reading of the room as merely abandoned. None of this proves a hidden chamber beyond, but it does explain why the subterranean chamber has never fully settled into the category of solved architecture. And then there is the emotional effect of the place itself. The upper chambers of the Great Pyramid feel architectural. This lower one feels older than architecture, as though the monument has passed into the earth and become something almost geological. The passage leading to it is narrow and descending, and the chamber opens only after that long movement downward. By the time one reaches it, the pyramid no longer feels like an object standing in the desert. It feels like a threshold between built space and the deeper stone beneath the plateau. That may be one reason the room has exerted such power over explorers and writers since the 19th century. For a sleep documentary, this is perhaps the quietest and strangest thought of all. The Great Pyramid is most famous for what rises above the horizon, but one of its most persistent mysteries lies below the level of the earth, in a chamber that appears unfinished, yet too carefully placed to ignore. Was it truly abandoned? Was it an early stage in a changing design? Was it meant to remain rough? We do not have final answers. What we do have is a room cut into the bedrock beneath the largest pyramid in Egypt, reached by a descending passage that seems to pull the monument downward into shadow. And from that room, the questions only deepen. Because once we accept that the subterranean chamber is real, deliberate, and still not fully explained, another possibility begins to emerge.
If the subterranean chamber already makes the Great Pyramid feel stranger than most people expect, the next step in the story takes us even deeper, into the question of water beneath Giza. At first, that idea may sound surprising. We imagine the pyramids in dry desert air, surrounded by stone and sand. But the plateau is not only a surface landscape, it is also a geological one, with layers below ground and with a documented groundwater system that modern researchers have studied because of the risk it poses to monuments on the plateau. A 2019 geophysical study identified a near-surface groundwater aquifer and mapped water table elevations across the Giza area, confirming that water beneath the plateau is not a fantasy or a metaphor, but a real and measurable part of the site. That matters because once we begin thinking about the lower chambers of the Great Pyramid, the stone below the monument no longer is just empty support. It becomes a place where architecture, geology, and hidden moisture meet. The builders may not have understood groundwater in modern scientific terms, but they certainly understood the behavior of stone, the physical character of the plateau, and the practical realities of cutting deep into bedrock. The lower world of the pyramid would never have been separate from the ground conditions around it. This is one reason water keeps returning to the story of Giza. Not always in the Great Pyramid itself, and not always in ways we can fully reconstruct, but in the broader underground landscape of the plateau. One of the clearest examples is the structure now called the Osiris Shaft, beneath the causeway of Khafre. Zahi Hawass's published account describes a complex of 3 vertical shafts leading to 3 underground levels, with additional chambers on the lower levels. At the deepest level, excavators found a large chamber with a central platform and a sarcophagus, and water was an unavoidable part of that underground environment. The importance of that discovery is not that it proves some hidden legend beneath the Great Pyramid itself. It does not. But it does remind us that underground Giza was never simple. Beneath the plateau, there are shafts, chambers, reused funerary spaces, and water-related conditions that made deep excavation difficult even in modern times. Hawass's account makes clear that this lower world had to be reached in stages, and that the deepest spaces were part of a real subterranean landscape, not merely an idea projected onto the desert from above. And that brings us back to the Great Pyramid. If the plateau beneath Giza contains groundwater, and if other underground structures in the area interacted with that lower environment, then the subterranean chamber of Khufu's pyramid begins to feel less isolated. It still remains a unique space within the monument, and we should be careful not to force one site to explain another. But the presence of water under Giza helps us understand why deep underground chambers on the plateau could feel symbolically powerful as well as physically difficult to access. Water below the stone would have added to the sense that these spaces belonged to a lower realm, separate from the sunlit world above. This does not mean we should turn the story into speculation. We do not need to claim hidden lakes under the Great Pyramid, or imagine vast secret canals, or treat every shaft as proof of a buried mystery. The historical picture is more restrained and in some ways more interesting. There really is groundwater beneath the plateau. There really are deep subterranean spaces at Giza. And there really are chambers, shafts, and lower structures whose relationship to water made exploration difficult and perhaps meaningful. For the ancient Egyptians, that would have mattered. Their funerary world was never only architectural, it was also cosmological. The journey of the dead involved darkness, thresholds, hidden passages, and the movement from one realm to another. Even without making claims we cannot prove, it is not hard to see why the lower parts of Giza, stone below the plateau, underground chambers, and water beneath the earth, could feel charged with religious significance. The underworld was never imagined as empty. It was a realm to be entered, crossed, and understood through symbol as much as through stone. So, as we continue downward in thought, the Great Pyramid becomes more than a massive tomb rising into the sky. It also becomes part of a deeper terrain, a monument above, bedrock below, and beneath that, the possibility of moisture, darkness, and sacred depth. And once that possibility enters the story, another part of Giza begins to feel newly important. The shafts, caves, and natural irregularities that connect the built pyramid to the hidden geology beneath it.
To understand the underground world of Giza more fully, we need to step away from the Great Pyramid for a moment, though not very far. Because elsewhere on the plateau, beneath the causeway of Khafre, archaeologists found another deep structure that helps us imagine what below Giza could really mean. It is now known as the Osiris Shaft. This was not a modern fantasy and not a legend preserved only in rumor. Zahi Hawass published the excavation as a real subterranean complex cut into the bedrock, accessed by a sequence of vertical shafts leading down through multiple levels. In his account, the complex consists of 3 shafts and 3 main levels, with additional chambers branching from the deeper parts. That alone is enough to change the atmosphere of the plateau. Above ground, Giza is a world of sunlight, horizon, and stone architecture rising into the air. But below ground, at least in some places, it becomes a world of descent, shaft after shaft, chamber after chamber, moving down into darkness beneath the familiar monuments. The first level of the Osiris Shaft is relatively simple. Deeper down, the second level opens into a larger arrangement with side chambers, and Hawass reported sarcophagi and finds associated with later reuse of the complex, especially in the Site period. In other words, this lower world was not used only once. It had a long history, with older underground architecture later re-entered and adapted by other generations. But it is the deepest level that gives the structure its strange power. At the bottom, Hawass described a large subterranean chamber with a central stone platform surrounded by water, and on that platform stood a sarcophagus. It is an image that feels almost dreamlike even when described in cautious archaeological language. A burial installation deep below the plateau, stone rising from still dark water, hidden beneath one of the most famous landscapes in the world. It is important to be careful here. The Osiris Shaft is not beneath the Great Pyramid itself, and it does not explain the subterranean chamber of Khufu's monument. We should not flatten the whole plateau into one idea, but it does show something essential. It shows that deep underground architecture at Giza was real, complex, and in some cases intimately bound up with water, darkness, later reuse, and funerary meaning. That matters because the Great Pyramid is often imagined in isolation, as though its internal mystery were unique and sealed off from the rest of the plateau. The Osiris Shaft reminds us that Giza had a broader subterranean dimension. The world below the monuments was not empty. It contained cut shafts, chambers, burial features, and spaces whose lower environments could be difficult even for modern archaeologists to reach and study. And perhaps, more quietly, it reminds us of something else. Ancient Egyptian sacred architecture did not always separate monument and underworld cleanly. A structure could rise above the desert and still belong symbolically to what was below. A shaft descending into darkness was not merely practical, it could also feel like a passage between realms. The Osiris Shaft, with its depth, water, and funerary associations, gives us a rare and vivid glimpse of how powerful that lower realm could be at Giza. This interpretation is grounded in the excavated form of the complex and in Hawass's reading of its symbolic association with Osiris, though the exact ritual meaning of every part remains debated. So as we return in thought to the Great Pyramid, we do so with a different sense of scale. Not only the scale above ground, measured in height and stone, but the scale below ground as well, measured in depth, hidden chambers, vertical descent, and the long patience of bedrock. And once we begin thinking that way, another overlooked feature inside Khufu's pyramid becomes newly important: the well shaft and the strange natural grotto through which it passes. If the subterranean chamber makes the Great Pyramid feel deeper than most people expect, the next feature makes it feel stranger. Inside the pyramid, beyond the better-known passages, there is another route linking the upper interior to the lower system below. It is usually called the well shaft, sometimes the service shaft, a narrow, irregular passage that connects the lower end of the grand gallery area to the descending passage farther down. It does not move in the clean, monumental way the main passages do. It twists, it narrows, it feels less ceremonial, more hidden, almost improvised when compared with the severe geometry of the pyramid's principal interior. And yet, it is not a modern intrusion. For a long time, scholars and explorers have debated exactly when the shaft was cut and what it was for. Some explanations have treated it as practical, perhaps a route used by workers, perhaps a way of moving through the pyramid after parts of the upper system were blocked, perhaps a utilitarian feature rather than a sacred one. The fact that such debate exists is important in itself. The well shaft has never settled into the category of simple architecture. It belongs to that uneasy class of pyramid features that clearly mattered, but whose purpose is still not fully agreed upon. What makes it more remarkable is what happens part way along its route. The shaft passes through a small cavity known as the grotto. Flinders Petrie described this so-called grotto not as a carved chamber in the usual sense, but as a fissure in the limestone through which the passage had been carried. In other words, the shaft intersects a natural irregularity in the bedrock, a place where the pyramid's internal architecture meets a pre-existing feature of the stone itself. That detail is easy to miss, but it changes the feeling of the whole system. The Great Pyramid is often imagined as total design, every angle planned, every corridor measured, every chamber deliberately set into place, and much of that is true. But the grotto reminds us that the monument also had to negotiate with geology. There were places where natural stone mattered, where the builders were not only imposing order on the plateau, but responding to what they found inside it. The pyramid, even here, was not entirely separate from the ancient rock beneath Giza. This is why the grotto has such imaginative power. It is not grand like the King's Chamber. It is not famous like the Grand Gallery. It is not even especially elegant. But it is one of the places where the monument feels most alive as a physical thing, less like an abstract symbol, and more like a structure cut through, around, and into a difficult natural world. The shaft is narrow. The stone changes character. Geometry gives way, briefly, to irregularity. And hidden there, inside one of the most studied buildings on Earth, is a small reminder that the pyramid was never built in isolation from the ground that held it. Of course, that does not solve its meaning. Was the well shaft mainly practical? Was it mainly symbolic? Did the grotto matter because it was useful or because it was unusual? The honest answer is that we do not know with certainty. But we do know enough to say this: the shaft is real, the grotto is real, and together they reveal a side of the Great Pyramid that is less smooth and monumental than the outer form suggests. Behind the clean silhouette of the pyramid lies a more complicated internal world of turns, hidden links, geological fissures, and passages that do not behave like the neat diagrams in a textbook. And once we recognize that, the pyramid begins to change again. It is no longer only a tomb of overwhelming scale. It becomes a layered interior landscape, a monument above ground, a chamber below ground, a shaft threading between them, and a natural fissure caught inside the root, like the old stone of the plateau refusing to disappear completely into architecture. Because even after 2 centuries of exploration, the Great Pyramid is still not fully mapped in the way people often assume.
In recent years, modern non-invasive scanning has begun to reveal hidden spaces that earlier generations did not know were there. For more than 2 centuries, explorers entered the Great Pyramid by crawling, measuring, clearing debris, and looking directly at stone. But in recent years, a different kind of investigation has changed the way we study the monument. Instead of breaking through walls or widening passages, researchers have increasingly relied on non-invasive scanning, muon imaging, radar, ultrasonic testing, and other methods designed to see into the pyramid without damaging it. The most famous of these discoveries came in 2017 when the ScanPyramids team announced the detection of what is now called the ScanPyramids Big Void. Using 3 different muon detection methods, researchers identified a large hidden space above the Grand Gallery, with a minimum length of about 30 meters and a cross-section broadly comparable to the gallery below. It was the first major internal structure discovered in the Great Pyramid since the 19th century, and its exact function remains unknown. That matters not only because the void is large, but because of what it proves. It proves that even inside the most studied monument in Egypt, there are still significant spaces that earlier generations did not know were there. The Great Pyramid was never as fully known as people assumed. Its interior, even now, is still being mapped. Then, in 2023, the same broader research effort produced another important result: the identification of a previously unknown corridor-shaped structure behind the north face of the pyramid, near the original entrance. This north face corridor was characterized as roughly 9 meters long, around 2 meters wide, and about 2 meters high, with a gabled form. Its presence was later supported by additional non-destructive studies, including multimodal image fusion work published in 2025. Again, the meaning of the corridor is still debated. It may have had a structural role. It may belong to a construction logic we do not yet fully understand. But whether its purpose was practical, architectural, or something more complex, the larger point remains the same. The pyramid still contains spaces hidden behind stone, unknown for more than 4.5 millennia, and only now becoming visible through modern science. This is where we have to be disciplined. Because once new discoveries appear, speculation grows quickly around them, and some of that speculation goes far beyond what the evidence can support. The strongest historical position is the quieter one. There are real hidden spaces. Some have now been detected with high confidence, but their precise functions are not yet settled. The science is revealing structure faster than interpretation can explain it. And perhaps that is the most fascinating place to leave the question. The old explorers gave us passages, chambers, and measurements. Modern imaging has added voids and corridors that no human eye had seen. And somewhere between those two worlds, between crawling in darkness and scanning with particles from the sky, the Great Pyramid has become mysterious again.
So tonight we have followed the Great Pyramid downward, not only into its passages and chambers, but into a different way of seeing it. What rises above the desert is only the visible half of the monument. Below that great mass of limestone lies another world, bedrock cut into form, a subterranean chamber that still resists easy explanation. hidden shafts linking upper and lower spaces, and a monument that modern scanning has shown is still not fully known even now. The ScanPyramids' Big Void and the North Face Corridor are reminders that the interior of Khufu's pyramid is still being discovered, not only remembered. And perhaps that is why the Great Pyramid continues to feel so powerful. It is not only large, it is layered. It rises toward the sky, but it also descends into the earth. It is a structure of sunlight above and shadow below, a monument of geometry on the outside and uncertainty within. The more quietly we sit with it, the less it feels like a single stone mountain, and the more it feels like a meeting point between architecture and geology, intention and mystery, the human will to build and the older stone of the plateau that received that will. We do not need to solve every question tonight. We do not need to force the subterranean chamber into a final meaning, or pretend that every shaft and hidden space already has a neat explanation. It may be enough to leave the pyramid where it has stood for 45 centuries, silent, immense, and still holding something back. A chamber in the bedrock, a passage descending into darkness, a hidden corridor behind stone, a monument that is still, even now, not finished with us. And so, as the desert grows quiet again, we can leave the Great Pyramid there.